Fujifilm has been making medium format digital cameras more accessible and approachable over the years. When it comes to shooting medium format, you don't only get a jump in detail and resolution, but there's also a special and unique look that comes with it. And for myself, when it comes to shooting medium format film, my favorite medium format camera is the Pentax 645N. That's why when I first got the chance to try the first GFX50S way back in 2017, I jumped at the chance to shoot it side by side with this Pentax 645. And now, 5 years later, I was given the chance by Fujifilm Australia to borrow this GFX50S II and assess how this latest version feels to use, just shoot it for fun, and of course, do a little bit of a comparison to some medium format film. Now, this video won't be as comprehensive as my X Pro 3 film shooter's perspective video in terms of comparing various film stocks to all the different simulations in this GFX, because I feel like a lot of that was already covered there, but also because I didn't have as much time with this particular camera. And I did at least get to shoot one of my last rolls of Fuji Pro 400H in the Pentax and do some side-by-side comparisons for you all to see. But before diving a bit deeper into those comparisons, I'm just gonna do a few breakdowns of some key points that I wanted to share about this camera. So if you want, you can check out some of the chapter markers in the description below, and let's get into it. So one of the strongest points, I think, of this latest GFX50S II is its approachability. Not only in terms of price, because the price of this is probably one of the cheapest medium format cameras that are, as far as I'm aware, to have come out. And even compared to the first GFX50S, this is definitely a lot cheaper, even though it adds a few new features and capabilities. The price of this particular camera is not that far off from something like a Canon EOS R5, a camera that a lot of people would consider for professional work or even hobbyist stuff. So sure, it's not exactly cheap, but it is a lot more approachable than previous generations of medium format digital cameras used to be, while adding more capabilities. The other thing that makes it so approachable is just the ease of use and the fairly compact size for a medium format digital camera. So especially if you're familiar with Fujifilm's previous line of cameras in their APS-C sensors, you'll find a lot of familiarity with the way this is laid out, which is quite intuitive, easy to use. The menus are fairly approachable. The other cool thing is that this new version adds in-body image stabilization, which is great if you want to use it a little bit more handheld. So otherwise, why medium format? The obvious thing is more detail and resolution, which is great if you do professional work, for example. The other thing I noticed is a slight increase in dynamic range compared to cameras that I've shot regularly, like my Canon 5D Mark IV, and even compared to some of the other current range of Fujifilm APS-C sensors. I found that there was a little bit more leeway to recover highlights and shadows. Besides that technical stuff, the nice thing I think about medium format is just the unique look that it offers, that sense of depth. There's a certain charm to the transition from in to out of focus areas, especially when you're shooting at a shallower depth of field. The other nice thing is the way that the highlights roll off on this particular sensor compared to some of the smaller ones that Fujifilm offers and even some other full format sensors. So sure, the sensor isn't as big and it doesn't give you as much of that charm as something like a 120 film frame from a Pentax 6.7, for example, but it does still give you that jump up from a 35mm size digital sensor and even more so from a APS-C or smaller sensor. The next thing I wanted to touch on a little bit was the general ergonomics and quality of the camera. So as I mentioned, the size and weight makes it really approachable and versatile. I was even able to fit this in my small Honor Bowery everyday camera bag that I often use for my Leica and smaller cameras, and it was able to fit with an extra lens in there perfectly fine. It has weather sealing, the build quality is great, everything in terms of the controls and the actual camera feels really smooth and refined, and that is what you want, I think, when you're investing this much in a camera. In terms of the lenses, I had nothing to complain about. I'm not going to get too technical with this, but the images looked great, and that was the point. I was able to borrow 3 lenses. One of them was a 63mm prime lens I have here. There was a 35 to 70mm zoom, and also 120mm macro lens, which you might be familiar with if you saw one of my previous video where I used this lens to digitize some film just for experimentation's sake, but even for photography, that lens was quite nice. They all rendered really well, and even the kit zoom lens that I had surprised me in terms of its capability. It was nice and sharp, the colors were great. Despite the fact that it has a variable aperture, it was still a solid performer. So that brings me to the next point. The overall output of this camera was the best thing about it for me personally. And within that category, it was all about the colors. The colors that came out of this camera was something special. And I know that a lot of the time people praise Fujifilm's cameras for their colors, but there was something a little bit different about this. The next big thing about this camera is the resolution and detail that you get out of a 50 megapixel sensor, which is really cool. But for me, it's much more than I can imagine myself needing for the type of work I do, which is often things like weddings and corporate events. But it is nice, and I'm sure a lot of people do appreciate having that extra detail. Another cool little thing is it does pretty decent video at 1080p. Now, the one restriction is there's no 4K, but the 1080p video that it does do does look quite nice with the benefit of in-body image stabilization and a lot of the nice simulations like Eterna. I won't go into any more detail on this, but I'm sure you didn't come to this video for the video features of this camera. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about with this camera is the overall speed. Now, the autofocus on this camera is quite good, quite reliable in the majority of situations that I used it in. There were a couple of examples though where it did miss focus, especially in situations where I was raising it to my eye quickly and trying to get a shot in a way that I would with perhaps some of my other cameras. This camera does use a contrast detect autofocus system, I believe, which is something that does make it a little bit slower than you might be used to from a more modern phase detect autofocus system that you'll find in other cameras. For most intents and purposes though, it was more than fast enough. So don't get me wrong, it wasn't noticeably slow when you're just shooting it in slower paced situations, but I wouldn't recommend getting this for doing things like sports or events where you need those quick reaction speeds. And something like street photography, sure, I experimented with it a little bit. You can use it for that if you like, but don't expect to have that immediate feedback that you might get from a really snappy autofocus system. If you want that higher AF speed, you want to go for the GFX100 series cameras. As far as I know, they have the phase detect or hybrid autofocus system, which should be noticeably faster than this one. But because of that sometimes little delay in focus that you'll get with this camera, the slightly slower feedback in terms of the shutter going off, and you actually feel the shutter sometimes when you press the button, it actually did bring it a little bit closer to that feeling of shooting medium format or shooting film in general. And it's kind of something a little bit hard to describe until you actually use the camera. But because it's not a blazingly fast type of experience that you get with this GFX, and I'm sure many other medium format cameras, it does bring it that little bit closer to the feeling of shooting film. So I had a roll of Fuji Pro 400H that I shot through the Pentax, and just putting some of the shots side by side, you can see that there's some obvious differences. Film has its own unique charm, and some of the things that might jump out to you, that the extra vibrance and pop that you get with some of the film scans, and just there's a general difference to the look that is undeniable, and it's not something that you could expect to perfectly simulate with digital. But it is interesting nonetheless just to look at the comparisons, just so that you can see what the difference might be if you're curious. I know I'm personally curious about these things, so it is fun to do, fun to compare. And zooming into the shots, you can see that the 50 megapixel images from the GFX have a lot more fine detail and lacking the grain of the film shots. But the grain and things like that are what give film its charm. And just for information, in these shots, the digital examples are largely unedited with the exception of just applying one of the various film simulations through Lightroom and some minor adjustments to white balance in some cases, just so that you can get an idea of what to expect from the output and how it varies compared to an average film scan. And obviously there's a lot of variability within film scans, but this should give you a rough idea. I tried to shoot a variety of different subjects, and one morning I got up early to get some landscape shots during some nice golden hour light with vibrant colors. So I'm at the local wetlands and trying to get a few landscape-ish shots. Now, it's not the most epic type of landscape, but it's beautiful nonetheless. There's good light, there's some nice color. So I've shot on both the GFX and the Pentax 645N with the 400H. And it'll be interesting to see how they differ. And there's a couple of nice, I think they're called weeping willows, the trees that I'll show you in a shot in a moment, but I'll get a couple of photos of as well. So I've shot both of those at f4, which I know might be a little bit different in terms of depth of field because this film frame size is a bit larger than this sensor, but it should be interesting nonetheless just to see the difference in rendering between the medium format digital camera and the Pentax film camera. Sarah and I also used the camera around the house just to do some fun shots, some self-portraits, and she also got the opportunity to try the camera herself, and from the first time she used it, she actually really loved it and sent me a message saying, hey, we should go halves and buy one of these things. And that was just to show how much she really noticed the jump in detail compared to her Fuji X-T3 when going up to this GFX camera. And to finish the roll of 400H in the Pentax for the side-by-side comparisons, I tried to get some photos in hard sort of midday light. And for that, I was able to find some nice neighborhood scenes on a late morning. Wouldn't be a film shooter if I didn't get a shot of the corner. So I actually spoke to the guy who lived in this house, the owner of these cars, and managed to get a few portraits of him on the GFX50S II. Unfortunately, by that point, however, I'd already run out of film in the Pentax, so I wasn't able to get side-by-side comparisons of that, but I think you kind of get the idea, and I really was pleased with the way the portraits came out on this camera. Again, the colors were fantastic, and it was good fun just to stumble across that scene and get a few extra portraits that I will be sending to the owner of those cars. And when it comes to overall thoughts comparing these two systems, it was really easy swapping back and forth between the two cameras in all the different occasions that I did do that. And they both offer their own unique looks in their own ways. One cool thing I did like about the GFX50S II was the new nostalgic neg film simulation that was built into this camera. I don't have that on the Fuji X100V, and I haven't seen it on any other cameras, so I believe it is mainly exclusive to some of the newer GFX cameras, and it actually was quite nice. I did use it for a lot of the images that you would have seen in this video and some that I posted online. And yeah, that was a nice little touch that gave it a little bit more of a filmic look. So who is this camera for? Well, I think it's for a lot more people than medium format digital cameras used to be for, given this current price point that the 50S II comes in at, whether it's for professional or commercial use, but really just for anyone who wants that amazing quality that you can get out of this camera. And I think that's inclusive of whether you already shoot film or not. This just makes it an attractive camera option in general. And in terms of who is it not for, well, I think anyone who wants super fast autofocus speed, someone who does want to shoot some video as well as do photos and is restricted by that limitation to 1080p. It also might not be suitable for anyone with high demand commercial or professional applications that actually need more megapixels than 50. That's why I think Fuji does the 100 series options. And lastly, the obvious thing is that it's still not suitable for anyone whose budget this camera is out of, which I'm sure is a lot of people, including myself. So in that case, what are the alternatives? Well, you can shoot film, obviously. It's still going to be a cheaper price of entry for most medium format 120 cameras, especially 645. But when it comes to some options out there, as we know, the prices are really getting higher and higher. Another great alternative, because this released, is the first version. I'm pretty sure that with the release of this, the price of the first GFX50S would have dropped a lot by now. So if you're not too fussed about things like in-body image stabilization and some of the other features that this one brings, there's really not too much difference. And I'm pretty sure the sensor is actually the same despite the different processor. So that, for example, might not be too far off from the price of many 120 645 format film cameras. All right, guys, so to sum up the video, overall, I love the camera. I really enjoyed using it. I wish I could keep it. And even though the capability that it has honestly goes beyond what I really need, it was nice to have and to actually use. So I'm really glad and thankful that Fujifilm Australia was nice enough to let me borrow this camera with no expectations, just to try it out, just to have some fun with it. And I definitely did. I think it's a seriously viable option for professional shooters in the current camera market and even for others. It even scratches some of that itch for film shooters like myself. Not all of it, but it scratches some of that itch. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you thought. Feel free to check out any of the information in the video description. Thanks for all the support as usual, and I'll see you in the next one.